The story of America's most violent prison war doesn't begin in the streets. It begins behind bars. Every day, millions of people pass by the massive gray walls of prisons without a second thought. To the outside world, these places are concrete fortresses meant to contain crime and restore order. But inside, they are something far more dangerous. Sealed battlegrounds where the rules of survival are written in blood. In these hidden arenas, the balance of power is always fragile. A look, a word, a rumor. Any of these could trigger a chain of violence that ends in death. And at the heart of this shadow war, two names loom larger than any others: the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family. The Aryan Brotherhood, born in the 1960s inside California's San Quentin State Prison, would grow to become one of the most feared white supremacist gangs in the country. Small in number, but ruthless in violence, they earned a reputation as the deadliest organization per capita inside the prison system. They thrived on control, extortion, and a culture of brutality where murder was not a possibility, it was a requirement. On the other side, the Black Guerrilla Family emerged almost at the same time. Founded in 1966 by revolutionary George Jackson, the BGF was more than just a prison gang. It was a political movement forged behind bars, built on the ideas of black power, Marxist theory, and armed resistance against the system itself. Where the Aryan Brotherhood swore loyalty to white supremacy, the Black Guerrilla Family swore to wage war against oppression. Two ideologies, two armies, locked in the same cages. Their very existence made peace impossible. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, prisons in California had become boiling points for racial and ideological tension. The civil rights movement was shaking the outside world while the rise of extremist countercultures echoed behind prison walls. Segregated yards kept races apart, but they could not erase the hatred. And in the darkness of cell blocks, leaders were making decisions that would shape decades of bloodshed to come. This was not an ordinary rivalry. The Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family were not simply fighting for turf or money. They were fighting for identity, for survival, and for dominance inside one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. Each group became the other's natural enemy. Their conflict would spread like wildfire, igniting riots, ambushes, and assassinations. For the men trapped between them, the thousands of prisoners who weren't part of either group, life became a deadly calculation. Neutrality was no shield. A man could be killed for the color of his skin, the wrong association, or even for standing in the wrong part of the yard. As the decades unfolded, this war would consume lives, shape the way prisons were run, and influence the very structure of organized crime in America. It would become one of the bloodiest sagas in the history of incarceration. And it all began in a war behind walls. To understand the war between the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family, you have to return to the 1960s, a decade of revolution, unrest, and rebellion, not just on the streets of America, but also behind the walls of its prisons. In those years, California's prison system was undergoing a transformation. The state had built massive new facilities designed to hold thousands of men. But overcrowding, racial segregation, and brutal conditions created a pressure cooker of violence. Inside San Quentin, one of the toughest prisons in the country, a small group of white inmates banded together. They were tired of being outnumbered by black and Latino gangs, and they turned to a familiar creed: white supremacy. Inspired by outlaw biker culture, neo-Nazi ideology, and a ruthless belief in survival of the fittest, They formed a brotherhood. Their emblem, a shamrock. Their rules, blood in, blood out. Kill for the gang, and your place was secure. Try to leave, and you signed your own death warrant. This was the birth of the Aryan Brotherhood around 1964. At first, they were simply about protection. A circle of white inmates who refused to be victims. But almost immediately, they became predators. They discovered that fear was power. They began running extortion rackets, drug smuggling, and contract killings. Within just a few years, their name carried a simple message. Cross them, and you die. But at the same time, in the same place, another force was rising. In 1966, George Jackson, a young man serving time in Soledad prison, was immersing himself in radical literature. He read Marx, Lenin, and Mao. He saw the prison system not just as punishment, but as a weapon of oppression, a way to cage black men and silence a movement. Jackson became a leader, and with his followers, he founded the Black Guerrilla Family. The BGF was not just a gang. It was a revolutionary organization with a clear political mission: to overthrow the U.S. government, to fight racism, and to unify black prisoners against their enemies. Members took oaths, pledging loyalty unto death. They studied political ideology as much as they sharpened weapons. For the BGF, every fight in prison was part of a much larger war, the war against oppression. The difference between the two groups could not have been sharper. The Aryan Brotherhood built itself on racial hatred, criminal enterprise, and a code of extreme violence. The Black Guerrilla Family built itself on revolutionary struggle, political identity, and militant unity. Yet both shared one thing: an absolute commitment to their cause. Neither side would compromise. By the late 1960s, prisons like San Quentin and Folsom became battlegrounds. On one yard, white inmates tattooed with shamrocks and swastikas sharpened makeshift knives. On another, black inmates drilled in secret, organized by BGF leaders who spoke of revolution. The flashpoints came quickly. In 1971, George Jackson was shot and killed during an escape attempt from San Quentin. To his followers, he became a martyr. His death radicalized the BGF even further, convincing them that their struggle could only be answered with blood. The Aryan Brotherhood, for their part, took advantage of the chaos, striking harder, consolidating their control, and turning every confrontation into a lesson in brutality. From these beginnings, the rivalry was etched in stone. For decades to come, the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family would clash again and again on prison yards, in dining halls, and in solitary cells. Every stabbing, every riot, every ambush was another chapter in a war that seemed destined to never end. Two groups, born in the same era, under the same brutal conditions, two visions that could never coexist. Their origins made them enemies for life. By the 1970s, California's prisons had become laboratories of violence. The state's overcrowded system, designed to warehouse men rather than rehabilitate them, turned into a breeding ground for gangs, alliances, and bloodshed. San Quentin, Folsom, Soledad, names that echoed like warnings. These prisons were supposed to be secure, but inside their walls, chaos reigned. Correctional officers were outnumbered, stretched thin, and often corrupt. On the yards, racial segregation wasn't just policy, it was survival. Whites, blacks, and Latinos staked out their sections of the chow hall, the exercise yards, even the showers. Every interaction was weighed with suspicion, every glance a test of dominance. It was here, in these conditions, that the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family hardened into mortal enemies. For the Aryan Brotherhood, California's prisons were an empire to conquer. though they made up less than 1% of the prison population. Their reputation for brutality allowed them to control far more. They struck with precision. Stabbings in the chow hall, ambushes in the yard, assassinations ordered from solitary confinement. Their members weren't afraid to die, and they weren't afraid to kill. For them, the yard was a battlefield, and violence was currency. On the other side, the Black Guerrilla Family built their ranks with discipline and ideology. They recruited from the growing number of young black men being incarcerated during the 1970s. Men who arrived angry, radicalized, and ready to fight. The BGF didn't just offer protection, they offered purpose. Members saw themselves as soldiers in a revolutionary war, and the prison system was their front line. The result was inevitable. Blood spilled on California's concrete yards. One of the most infamous flashpoints came in 1971, when George Jackson was killed during a breakout attempt from San Quentin. His death shook the entire prison system. To the BGF, Jackson was a martyr, proof that the state would kill to silence their movement. Riots erupted, cells burned, and correctional officers braced for war. The Aryan Brotherhood, sensing weakness, pushed harder, stabbing BGF members at every opportunity. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, this pattern repeated itself. The prisons became locked in a cycle of retaliation. When a member of the AB was killed, Black Guerrilla Family soldiers could expect to pay in blood. When a BGF member was assassinated, AB leaders ordered new contracts, sometimes weeks or months later, to balance the score. The prison yards became staging grounds for coordinated attacks. Men armed with shanks made from typewriter parts, bed frames, and toothbrushes launched ambushes in broad daylight. Blood soaked the dirt and concrete. Guards rushed in too late, dragging away bodies, locking down the facilities, only for the violence to erupt again weeks later. By the 1980s, California officials realized they had lost control. Pelican Bay State Prison was opened in 1989 as a supermax facility designed to isolate gang leaders. But even in solitary confinement, the Aryan Brotherhood and Black Guerrilla Family adapted. Messages were smuggled through coded notes, legal mail, and even written on tiny slips of paper hidden inside body cavities. Orders went out. Murders continued. The war did not stop. The crucible of California's prisons forged two armies of men who had nothing left to lose. Their hatred wasn't just personal. It was ideological, racial, and generational. Entire wings of prisons were scarred by their battles, their stories whispered in fear by other inmates who knew neutrality was not an option. California's prisons weren't just places of punishment. They had become war zones, sealed-off arenas where the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family fought for supremacy. And every death, every ambush, every act of violence inside those walls sent a message. This was a war with no truce and no end in sight. The war between the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family was never random. It was governed by rules, harsh, unforgiving codes that dictated who lived, who died, and how loyalty was proven. For the Aryan Brotherhood, the code was simple: blood in, blood out. There was no easy entry and no way out. To join, a man had to spill blood, often killing another inmate chosen by the Brotherhood's leaders. It wasn't just a test of violence, it was a test of commitment. If you could take a life for the gang, you were worthy of becoming part of it. But leaving was impossible. Any brother who tried to walk away would be marked for death, hunted down by his own. Discipline was absolute. Betrayal or disobedience was punished swiftly and violently. Orders from leaders known as shot callers were treated as law. Refuse an order, and you risked your life. The Brotherhood demanded loyalty not just in word, but in blood. It was a world where brutality wasn't just encouraged, it was the price of admission. On the other side, the Black Guerrilla Family held to a different, but equally uncompromising, code. Founded by George Jackson as a revolutionary vanguard, the BGF demanded that its members see themselves as soldiers in a political struggle. Every member swore an oath of loyalty to the cause of Black liberation. The oath was binding, sealed with life and death. The BGF's code emphasized secrecy, unity, and discipline. Members studied ideology as much as they trained for violence. They were taught to view the prison system as a battlefield and themselves as guerrilla fighters behind enemy lines. For the BGF, every act of violence carried symbolic weight. It was not just a killing, but a strike against oppression. Yet despite these ideological differences, both gangs mirrored each other in their methods. Both relied on fear to maintain order. Both used extortion and intimidation to control the prison economy, drugs, gambling, contraband. Both demanded absolute loyalty, with death as the only punishment for betrayal. And both mastered the art of psychological warfare. In prison, the threat of violence often mattered more than the act itself. The Aryan Brotherhood's reputation for merciless killings made many inmates submit without resistance. The Black Guerrilla Family's image as a disciplined, organized force made others fear crossing them. Rumors spread faster than reality, amplifying the aura of danger that surrounded both groups. The codes also shaped how the two gangs fought their war. The Brotherhood's rules ensured that its members would carry out assassinations without hesitation. When a green light was issued, a death order, there was no debate. A target could be a rival, an informant, or even a former brother. The BGF's rules demanded that members act not just as killers, but as soldiers of a movement. Their violence was framed as revolutionary justice, their assassinations as acts of war. Neutrality was impossible. In the pressure cooker of California's prisons, inmates were forced to choose sides or risk becoming casualties caught in the middle. A man's skin color often determined his fate. Whites were expected to align with the Brotherhood. Blacks were expected to stand with the BGF. Those who resisted alignment were pressured, threatened, or eliminated. The codes of war kept the cycle alive. Each assassination, each stabbing, each riot was justified by the rules of one side or the other. There was no forgiveness, no negotiation. Once blood was spilled, more blood had to follow. Over time, these codes would do more than just enforce loyalty. They would institutionalize the war itself. The Brotherhood and the BGF were no longer just prison gangs. They had become armies, bound by rules, driven by ideology, and locked in a conflict that could not end. In a world where survival depended on allegiance, the code was everything. And in the shadows of the cell blocks, these codes wrote the script for decades of violence. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the rivalry between the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family was no longer just a clash of ideologies. It had become a blood feud, personal, relentless, and escalating with every year. The cycle of violence fed on itself. Every killing demanded retaliation, and every retaliation pushed the war deeper. The prison yards of California became killing fields where men lived in constant anticipation of the next attack. The Aryan Brotherhood struck first with precision assassinations. They targeted BGF leaders, men they knew would rally resistance. A stabbing in the chow hall, a shank driven home in the shower, a body left bleeding in the exercise yard. These weren't random acts. They were carefully orchestrated moves designed to cripple the BGF's chain of command. But the Black Guerrilla Family answered in kind. Their soldiers ambushed Aryan Brotherhood members in equally brutal fashion. BGF attacks were carried out with the discipline of a military strike, planned, timed, and executed with the knowledge that every death was part of a greater war. One of the bloodiest arenas was San Quentin Prison, where the death of George Jackson in 1971 had already ignited a storm. In the years that followed, both the AB and the BGF turned the facility into a proving ground. Inmates were stabbed on the yard in full view of guards and other prisoners, sometimes with weapons so crude yet so effective they caused catastrophic injuries. Shanks made from bed frames, typewriter parts, or even melted down toothbrushes. Folsom Prison, too, became a flashpoint. Riots erupted when BGF and AB members were released onto the same yard. Fistfights escalated to knife fights. Knife fights escalated to full-scale brawls involving dozens of men. Guards would fire warning shots from the towers, tear gas would cloud the air, and the ground would be littered with bleeding bodies. By the mid-1980s, the feud had gone beyond the walls. On the streets of California's cities, soldiers aligned with the Aryan Brotherhood and the BGF carried the war into neighborhoods. Drug turf, extortion rackets, and parole violations tied directly back to the conflict in prison. Men who walked out of the gates carried their loyalties with them, often serving as enforcers or executioners for orders that originated in a solitary cell hundreds of miles away. Both gangs used green light lists, hit lists naming enemies marked for death. Once a name was on the list, there was no escape. Whether inside prison or walking free, the target was hunted until the order was carried out. These green lights escalated the conflict even further, ensuring that the war was never confined to one facility, or even one state. The violence reached a point where correctional officers were forced to change how they managed prisons. Yard releases were separated by race. Entire wings of facilities were locked down for weeks at a time. In some cases, inmates were moved across the state just to break up clusters of AB or BGF members. But the gangs adapted. Wherever they were housed, the war followed. For the men trapped in the middle, those who were neither Brotherhood nor Guerrilla, life became a daily gamble. A neutral inmate might be caught in a crossfire, mistaken for an enemy, or pressured into carrying out a hit. Survival wasn't just about avoiding violence. It was about navigating a battlefield where allegiances meant life or death. By the end of the 1980s, the blood feud had carved itself into the DNA of California's prison system. The Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family were no longer just rival gangs. They were bitter enemies locked in a generational war. Each new stabbing, each new riot, was not just an act of violence. It was another entry in a long ledger of vengeance, a war without winners, only survivors. By the 1990s, the war between the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family had spilled so much blood that it could no longer be ignored. California's prison system was in constant lockdown. Riots were erupting with deadly regularity, and the violence was seeping into the streets. Law enforcement knew they had to act. The state turned to a new weapon, federal prosecution. Using racketeering laws originally designed to dismantle the mafia, the Department of Justice began targeting prison gangs as criminal enterprises. For the Aryan Brotherhood, the turning point came in 2002. Federal prosecutors unveiled one of the largest indictments in prison history. 40 members of the AB, including its leadership, were charged under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. The indictment accused them of running a nationwide murder-for-hire operation from behind bars, orchestrating stabbings, drug trafficking, and extortion with military precision. For some leaders, prosecutors sought the death penalty. At the same time, the Black Guerrilla Family was also in the crosshairs. The FBI had been monitoring the group for years, using informants and undercover operations. Federal agents painted the BGF not only as a prison gang, but as a revolutionary organization with ties to radical political movements outside the walls. In the 1980s and 1990s, dozens of members were swept up in RICO cases, hit with conspiracy charges, and given life sentences designed to decapitate the gang's leadership. But both groups had been preparing for this. They had learned to survive lockdowns, to issue orders from solitary confinement, and to keep their organizations alive even when their generals were locked in steel cages. Inside Pelican Bay's notorious Security Housing Unit, SHU, leaders of the AB and BGF lived in near-total isolation. They spent 23 hours a day in cells the size of bathrooms, denied contact with the general population. Officials believed this would break their control, but it didn't. Messages still flowed. Orders were smuggled through coded letters, hidden inside legal documents, or passed from lawyer to client. In some cases, messages were written in invisible ink or relayed through wives and girlfriends visiting on the outside. The gangs adapted like organisms under pressure. The AB grew smaller, but deadlier, focusing on fewer but more loyal members. The BGF leaned on its street connections, using allied gangs in California cities to carry out orders while their leaders remained locked down. Even under federal crackdowns, the war continued. Only now it was fought more quietly, with assassinations carried out in the shadows rather than riots on the yard. The authorities celebrated victories. High-profile trials made headlines. B leaders were sentenced to death or life without parole. BGF generals were buried in federal supermax prisons, cut off from their soldiers. But the reality was sobering. The violence didn't end. It simply went underground. By the 2000s, investigators realized that both gangs had turned into networks. A single coded message from a solitary cell in California could spark a stabbing in another state, or even a murder on the streets of Los Angeles, Oakland, or Houston. The federal government had hoped to decapitate the snakes. Instead, they discovered hydras, organizations that adapted, survived, and kept killing. In the end, the crackdowns changed the war, but they did not end it. The Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family learned to fight under new conditions, where silence, secrecy, and coded loyalty replaced open riots and yard battles. The war was no longer always visible, but it was still there, alive in the shadows, moving through whispered orders and hidden alliances. The battlefield had shifted underground, but the blood feud remained. Decades of bloodshed between the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family left scars that went far beyond the men who fought it. The war reshaped America's prisons, transformed how law enforcement viewed gangs, and deepened racial divides that still define prison culture today. For prison officials, the rivalry forced a fundamental change in how facilities were managed. In California, integrated yards became impossible. Officials learned the hard way that placing AB and BGF members in the same space was a recipe for instant violence. The solution was segregation. Prisoners were housed by race, by gang affiliation, by threat level. Dining halls, exercise yards, and even recreation times were scheduled to keep enemies apart. But the walls of segregation didn't stop the war. They institutionalized it. Correctional officers adapted by adopting military-like strategies. Yard time meant armed guards in towers, rifles trained on inmates below. Search teams raided cells for contraband weapons. only to find that inmates could turn almost anything into a shank. Lockdowns became routine, days or weeks where prisoners remained locked inside cells 24 hours a day, entire facilities frozen by the threat of violence. The war also shaped policy at the highest levels. California pioneered supermax prisons like Pelican Bay, built specifically to isolate gang leaders. The theory was simple: cut off the head, and the body would die. But the reality proved otherwise. Even in solitary, leaders of both the Aryan Brotherhood and Black Guerrilla Family maintained influence, sending out coded orders, inspiring loyalty, and keeping the cycle alive. On the streets, the ripple effect was just as devastating. Both gangs used their prison power to control street crews. Local cliques became extensions of the war, tasked with carrying out murders, collecting drug profits, and enforcing loyalty. A fight that had begun in the cell blocks of San Quentin and Folsom now shaped violence in cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Bernardino. Street shootings and drug turf wars often trace back to orders that originated behind bars. The legacy also lived on in the culture of fear. For generations of inmates, entering prison meant stepping into a battlefield already divided by bloodlines. Young white prisoners were pressured into the Aryan Brotherhood's orbit. Young black prisoners were pulled toward the Black Guerrilla Family or allied sets. The choice wasn't ideological. It was survival. Neutrality was dangerous. To walk the yards without affiliation meant walking unprotected, always vulnerable to attack. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological. The constant cycle of violence hardened the prison system, erasing any pretense of rehabilitation. Guards and inmates alike adapted to a climate where violence was expected, even normalized. A stabbing on the yard wasn't just an incident. It was part of the rhythm of prison life. The idea of peace between the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family became unthinkable. Their war had lasted too long, claimed too many lives, and embedded itself too deeply into the prison's DNA. Even federal crackdowns failed to erase the rivalry. Every time leaders were removed, others rose to take their place. The organizations became less about individual men and more about systems of loyalty and vengeance. They were legacies in themselves, self-sustaining, self-perpetuating, impossible to dismantle completely. Today, prison administrators, law enforcement, and gang experts all acknowledge the same reality. The war between the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla Family changed the American prison system forever. It entrenched racial divides, reshaped policies, and ensured that behind the walls, survival would always come at a cost. The legacy of this prison war is not just written in blood. It's written in the very structure of the institutions meant to contain it. Fortresses where the battle lines are still drawn, decades after the first blows were struck.